Fort Verde appeared like a mirage in the desert heat, its wooden stockade walls and fluttering American flag, representing safety and civilization, to the exhausted soldiers who had walked 3 days through hostile territory. But as Company B approached the main gate, Captain Hayes felt no relief, only a growing dread about the explanations he would have to provide to his commanding officers. The sentries at the gate stared in amazement as 46 cavalry soldiers approached on foot, their uniforms torn and dusty, carrying no weapons and leading no horses. It was unprecedented for an entire company to return from patrol in such condition, and word of their arrival spread quickly through the fort like wildfire. Major General George Crook himself appeared at the headquarters building as Hayes led his men through the gate. Crook was a seasoned Indian fighter with a reputation for toughness and strategic thinking, but even he seemed stunned by the sight of an entire cavalry company returning in complete defeat. His weathered face showed no emotion as he watched the soldiers file past, but his eyes missed nothing. Hayes reported immediately to Crook's office, where he found himself facing not only the general, but also Colonel Matthews, the fort's commanding officer, and Captain Rodriguez, the intelligence officer responsible for tracking Apache movements. The 3 senior officers sat behind a heavy wooden desk while Hayes stood at attention. Knowing that his military career was about to end in disgrace, the interrogation began immediately, with Crook demanding a complete explanation of how an entire company had lost all its equipment without engaging in battle. Hayes had rehearsed his story during the long walk back to civilization, trying to find a way to tell the truth while minimizing the damage to his reputation and that of his men. He began with their pursuit of Cochise's band, describing how they had followed what appeared to be clear tracks into Red Valley. He explained about the disappearance of their Apache scout Carlos and their decision to continue the mission, despite the loss of their guide. The senior officers listened without interruption, their faces growing more skeptical with each detail. When Hayes reached the part about discovering the circular clearing and being surrounded by Apache warriors, Colonel Matthews interrupted to ask why they had not fought their way out rather than surrendering. The question struck at the heart of military doctrine, which demanded that soldiers fight to the death rather than give up their weapons to the enemy. Hayes tried to explain the tactical impossibility of their situation, describing how the Apache had used the natural amphitheater as a perfect trap where they could attack from above while remaining completely protected. But he could see in the officers' faces that they viewed his explanations as excuses for cowardice rather than legitimate military analysis. The revelation that former Lieutenant Marcus Thompson was fighting alongside the Apache caused an immediate stir in the room. Crook had known Thompson personally and was shocked to learn that a fellow officer had not only survived capture, but had actively joined the enemy. The implications for military security and intelligence were staggering. Hayes delivered Thompson's message about Apache willingness to discuss peace terms, but the senior officers showed little interest in negotiations. Their focus remained on the unprecedented surrender of an entire company and the military disaster that Hayes had brought back to their doorstep. Captain Rodriguez pressed for details about Apache numbers, weapons, and the location of their stronghold, but Hayes found himself in an impossible position. He had sworn an oath to Cochise not to reveal the location of the hidden valley, but military law required him to provide all intelligence information to his superiors. Violating either oath would have serious consequences. When Hayes refused to provide specific coordinates for the Apache stronghold, claiming that he had become lost during the march and could not accurately retrace their route, the atmosphere in the room became openly hostile. Crook accused him of protecting the enemy and suggested that he might face charges of treason as well as cowardice. The interrogation continued for hours, with the senior officers asking the same questions repeatedly and becoming increasingly frustrated with Hayes's answers. They could not understand how an experienced cavalry officer could allow his entire company to be defeated without firing a shot, and they suspected that he was hiding important details about what had really happened. Meanwhile, the enlisted men of Company B were facing their own investigations as junior officers questioned them about the events in Red Valley. The soldiers had agreed among themselves to support their captain's version of events, but the stress of repeated questioning began to take its toll on men who were already traumatized by their experience. Private Chen found himself particularly troubled by the conflict between loyalty to his captain and the military requirement to tell the complete truth. His diary entries from the patrol could contradict Hayes's story if they were discovered, but destroying them would be destroying a historical record of what had really happened. Sergeant O'Malley was called to testify before a board of inquiry that had been hastily convened to investigate the incident. His years of experience and reputation for honesty made his testimony particularly important, but he struggled with the same conflicts between truth and loyalty that plagued all the survivors. As news of the company's defeat spread beyond Fort Verde, newspaper reporters began arriving to interview the soldiers and gathered details about what they sensed was a significant military disaster. The Army tried to control the flow of information, but rumors and speculation filled the void left by official silence. The political implications of the incident extended far beyond military circles. Politicians in Washington were already facing criticism for the cost and ineffectiveness of Indian warfare in the Southwest, and the complete defeat of an entire cavalry company would provide ammunition for those who questioned the Army's competence and strategy. Hayes spent sleepless nights in his quarters, knowing that his military career was effectively over, regardless of the outcome of the official investigation. Court-martial proceedings were almost certain, and even if he avoided criminal charges, he would never receive another command or promotion. His dreams of advancement and honor had died in the red rocks of Apache territory. Investigation dragged on for weeks as military officials tried to understand what had happened and determine appropriate punishment for the officers and men involved. Some called for Hayes to be shot for cowardice, while others argued that he had made the only rational decision possible under impossible circumstances. Eventually, the Army decided to classify many details of the incident to avoid further embarrassment and political complications. Hayes received a dishonorable discharge and was quietly sent back east, where he disappeared into civilian life and never spoke publicly about his experience with Cochise. Most of the enlisted men were reassigned to other units after receiving official reprimands for their role in the surrender. They scattered across the frontier army, carrying with them memories of the day when Apache war cries made an entire company kneel in defeat, and mercy from their enemies proved more valuable than military honor. The circular clearing in Red Valley returned to its ancient silence, known only to the Apache, who continued to use it for ceremonies and councils. The abandoned weapons and equipment were redistributed among warriors who would use them in continuing battles against the Army that refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of Apache grievances. Thompson remained with Cochise's band, serving as a bridge between two worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. His story became a legend among both Apache and white communities, though each side interpreted his choice differently according to their own beliefs about loyalty, honor, and justice. The terror at Red Valley became a cautionary tale within military circles, though the full truth of what happened there remained buried in classified files for decades. It stood as a reminder that in the harsh landscape of the American Southwest, pride and prejudice could lead even experienced soldiers into traps where survival depended, not on superior weapons or training, but on the unexpected mercy of enemies they had been taught to consider savage. The words of surrender felt like poison in Captain Hayes's mouth as he called out his acceptance of Thompson's terms. Around him, his soldiers showed a mixture of relief and shame as they realized they would live to see another day, but at the cost of everything they had been taught to value as military men. Thompson nodded from his position on the clifftop and spoke rapidly in Apache to Cochise and the other warriors. The war chief listened carefully, then gave a series of hand signals that caused the Apache fighters to lower their weapons slightly, though they remained ready to resume the attack if the soldiers tried any tricks. The process of surrender began with Hayes ordering his men to place their rifles on the ground and step away from them. The sound of metal hitting stone echoed through the circular clearing as 46 soldiers gave up the weapons that represented their identity and purpose. Each rifle placed on the ground felt like another piece of their military souls being stripped away. Next came the cavalry sabers, the symbol of their mounted status and the traditional weapon of horse soldiers. The curved blades gleamed in the afternoon sun as they joined the rifles in growing piles of abandoned military equipment. Several younger soldiers had tears in their eyes as they surrendered weapons that had been presented to them with ceremony when they completed their training. The horses presented a more complicated problem. Many of the animals had been wounded by Apache arrows in the demonstration attack, and some were dying slowly in the hot sand of the clearing. Hayes requested permission to end the suffering of the injured horses, and after a brief consultation, Cochise agreed to allow the soldiers to put their wounded mounts out of their misery. The sound of gunshots echoed through the canyon as the soldiers performed this final military duty for their loyal animals. Private Chen wept openly as he shot his horse, a mare named Stella that had carried him safely through months of patrols in hostile territory. The bond between cavalry soldiers and their mounts was strong, and losing their horses felt almost as devastating as surrendering their weapons. Thompson climbed down from the clifftop using ropes and handholds. That seemed impossible for anyone not raised in this rocky landscape. Up close, he appeared older than Hayes had initially thought, with lines around his eyes that spoke of hardships endured and difficult choices made. His transformation from cavalry officer to Apache warrior was complete in every detail except for the sadness that lingered in his expression. The former lieutenant explained the practical details of their release. The soldiers would be allowed to keep their canteens, basic food supplies for 3 days, and their uniforms, though they would have to remove all military insignia and rank markings. They would walk out of Apache territory on foot, following a specific route that Thompson would describe to avoid sacred sites and active war parties. Most importantly, Thompson made each soldier swear a personal oath, never to reveal the location of the hidden stronghold or to return to this area with other military units. The oath was sworn not just to Cochise but to the spirits of the land itself, using words that Thompson had learned during his years with the Apache. The ceremony felt more binding than any military oath the soldiers had ever taken. Hayes found himself face to face with Thompson as the surrender process continued, and the two former cavalry officers studied each other with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Thompson asked Hayes about conditions at the various army forts, news from the outside world, and whether the military was still pursuing the same failed policies that had led to this endless cycle of violence. In return, Hayes questioned Thompson about his decision to abandon his own people and fight alongside their enemies. The former lieutenant's answer was complex and troubling, describing a gradual awakening to the injustices being committed against the Apache and a growing understanding that the Army's mission in Arizona was fundamentally wrong. Thompson explained that the Apache were not the mindless savages portrayed in military reports and newspaper stories. They were sophisticated people with rich cultural traditions, complex social structures, and legitimate grievances against the white settlers who were destroying their way of life. Living among them had opened his eyes to perspectives that white society refused to acknowledge. As the afternoon wore on, Apache warriors began descending into the clearing to collect the abandoned weapons and equipment. They moved with practiced efficiency, gathering rifles, ammunition, saddles, and anything else that might be useful in their continuing fight against the Army. The soldiers watched helplessly as their military gear was redistributed among their former enemies. Cochise himself finally descended from the cliff tops, moving with the dignity and grace of a natural leader despite his advanced age. He was smaller than Hayes had expected, but carried himself with an authority that made his presence felt throughout the clearing. His eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if he could see their souls and judge their true character. The Apache war chief spoke briefly with Thompson, who translated his words for the soldiers. Cochise said that he took no pleasure in humiliating brave men, but that the white soldiers needed to understand what it felt like to be powerless and at the mercy of others. This was the daily experience of his people, under the advancing tide of white settlement and military occupation. The war chief also warned that this mercy would not be extended again if any of these soldiers returned to Apache lands. He had shown restraint once out of respect for their courage in the face of certain death, but future encounters would end differently. The Apache were tired of being hunted and driven from their ancestral homes, and their patience with white intrusion was nearly exhausted. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Thompson began preparing the soldiers for their journey back to civilization. He provided detailed directions for reaching the nearest Army outpost, warning them about dangerous areas to avoid and water sources where they could refill their canteens along the way. The route would take them 3 days of hard walking through desert terrain that could kill unprepared travelers. Thompson emphasized that they needed to travel only during the early morning and late afternoon hours, taking shelter during the hottest part of each day. The desert was unforgiving to those who did not respect its power. Before the soldiers began their march, Thompson pulled Hayes aside for a private conversation. He warned the captain that reporting this incident accurately would likely end his military career, but that lying about what happened would eventually be discovered and result in even worse consequences. The choice of how to explain the loss of an entire company's equipment and horses would be Hayes's burden to bear. Thompson also gave Hayes a personal message to deliver to Major General Crook, explaining that the Apache were willing to discuss peace terms if the Army was genuinely interested in ending the bloodshed. Too many good men on both sides had died already, and there had to be a better solution than mutual extermination. As the soldiers prepared to leave the circular clearing that had nearly become their tomb, they took one last look at the Apache warriors who had spared their lives. The faces on the cliff tops showed no triumph or satisfaction, only the weary expressions of people who had seen too much war and hoped for something better. Private Chen picked up his pack and joined the column forming behind Captain Hayes. His diary would remain forever incomplete, the final entry describing a peaceful night under the stars, rather than the terror and humiliation that had followed. Like all the soldiers in the company, he would carry the memory of this day for the rest of his life, knowing that he owed his survival to the mercy of enemies he had been taught to hate. The desert sun was merciless as Captain Hayes led his demoralized company through the rocky landscape, following the route that Thompson had carefully described to them. Without horses, the soldiers struggled with the weight of their packs and the unforgiving terrain that seemed designed to break the spirit of anyone foolish enough to travel on foot. The first day of their march was a nightmare of heat, thirst, and humiliation. Men who had been proud cavalry soldiers just hours earlier now stumbled through the desert like refugees, their uniforms already showing stains of sweat and dust. The absence of their weapons made them feel naked and vulnerable, constantly looking over their shoulders for Apache warriors who might be following to finish what they had started. Private Chen's feet were already developing painful blisters, despite his military boots, and he was not alone in his suffering. The soldiers had been trained to fight from horseback, not to march long distances through hostile desert terrain. Every step was a reminder of how completely they had been defeated and stripped of everything that made them effective fighting men. Sergeant O'Malley tried to maintain some semblance of military discipline, calling out cadence and encouraging the younger soldiers to keep moving, but his heart was not in it. The shame of surrender weighed heavily on him, and he wondered how he would face his wife and children when he returned home with this story of failure and humiliation. Hayes found himself constantly second-guessing his decision to accept Thompson's terms. Part of him wondered if he should have chosen to fight and die, rather than live with the knowledge that he had surrendered an entire company without firing a shot in defense. The rational part of his mind knew he had saved lives, but military training and pride made rational thinking difficult. As they traveled, several soldiers began showing signs of heat exhaustion, despite Thompson's warnings about the dangers of desert travel. The temperature was over 100 degrees, and the reflected heat from the red rocks made it feel even hotter. Hayes ordered frequent rest stops in whatever shade they could find, knowing that losing men to the desert would make their defeat even more complete. During one of these rest breaks, Private Miller collapsed completely, his body unable to cope with the combination of stress, heat, and dehydration. His fellow soldiers carried him to a patch of shade and tried to cool him down with precious water from their canteens, but it was clear that he was in serious trouble. Without medical attention, he might not survive the journey back to civilization. The incident forced Hayes to make another difficult decision. They could either slow their pace to accommodate Miller's condition, risking the health of the entire company, or they could leave him behind with a small guard detail, while the main group continued toward safety. Neither option was acceptable to a professional soldier, who had been taught never to abandon wounded comrades. Hayes decided to have two of the strongest soldiers carry Miller between them, using rifles as a makeshift stretcher. The irony was not lost on anyone that they were using Apache weapons taken from their abandoned equipment to save the life of one of their own men. The enemy's tools were now keeping a cavalry soldier alive. As the day wore on, the soldiers began to understand why the Apache were such formidable fighters in this landscape. The desert itself was their ally, a harsh environment that punished anyone who did not know its secrets. Every rock, every canyon, every water source was part of a complex system that the Apache understood completely while white. Soldiers remained helpless outsiders. The first night of their march was spent in a small cave that Thompson had told them about, a natural shelter that provided protection from both the cold desert night and any Apache patrols that might be in the area. The soldiers huddled together for warmth, their pride as cavalry fighters reduced to the basic human need for survival. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares and the constant worry that Apache warriors might appear at any moment to finish what they had started in the circular clearing. Every sound outside the cave sent waves of fear through the exhausted soldiers, who had learned that their enemies could move through this landscape like ghosts. The second day brought new challenges as the terrain became even more difficult. They were climbing steadily through a series of rocky passes that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Without their horses, the soldiers had to navigate steep trails and loose rock slides that threatened to send them tumbling into deep canyons. Hayes noticed that his men were beginning to break down both physically and mentally. The combination of shame, exhaustion, and fear was taking a terrible toll on soldiers who had been confident and capable just days earlier. Some of the younger men were openly weeping, while others stared straight ahead with empty eyes that suggested their spirits had been broken completely. Private Chen tried to maintain his diary during rest stops, but found that words could not capture the horror of their situation. How could he describe to his mother the feeling of being completely helpless in the hands of enemies who had shown mercy when none was expected? How could he explain that the Apache they had been taught to hate had proven more honorable than many white men he had known? During one rest stop, Sergeant O'Malley approached Hayes with concerns about the mental state of several soldiers. Some were talking about deserting as soon as they reached civilization, abandoning the army rather than face the shame of explaining what had happened to them. Others were making wild plans for revenge, swearing to return with larger forces to wipe out every Apache in the territory. Hayes knew that both reactions were dangerous and wrong. Desertion would ruin the men's lives and brand them as cowards forever, while thoughts of revenge ignored the lessons they should have learned about Apache capabilities and the justness of their cause. But he also understood that men facing such complete defeat needed time to process what had happened to them. As they continued their march, the soldiers began to encounter signs of the outside world they had almost forgotten existed. First came old wagon ruts from supply trains, then discarded items left behind by other travelers, and finally the distant smoke of campfires that suggested they were approaching areas where white settlers lived and worked. The prospect of returning to civilization brought mixed emotions to the company. Relief at surviving their ordeal was tempered by dread at having to explain their situation to superior officers who would demand detailed accounts of how an entire cavalry company had lost all its equipment without firing a shot in battle. Hayes spent considerable time during their march trying to decide how he would report the incident to Major General Crook. The truth would likely end his career and result in court-martial proceedings, but lying would be discovered eventually and lead to even worse consequences. There seemed to be no way to emerge from this situation with his reputation intact. On the morning of the third day, they finally spotted the wooden buildings and American flag of Fort Verde in the distance. The sight should have filled them with joy, but instead, the soldiers felt only apprehension about the questions they would face and the punishment that awaited them. Their ordeal in Apache territory was ending, but a new kind of trial was about to begin. The Apache war chief's hand remained raised in the air as tension filled the circular clearing like a physical presence. Captain Hayes knew that when that hand dropped, death would rain down from the cliff tops in the form of arrows and rifle bullets. His soldiers crouched behind their dying horses and scattered rocks, weapons ready but knowing their situation was hopeless. Then something unexpected happened. A voice called out in English from the cliff tops, speaking with the accent of an educated man but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. The Apache war chief lowered his hand and turned toward the source of the voice, indicating that whoever had spoken held significant influence among the warriors. From a hidden position among the rocks emerged a figure that shocked the trapped soldiers. It was a white man, but one who had clearly lived among the Apache for many years. His skin was bronzed by the desert sun, his hair grown long and decorated with feathers and beads in the Apache style. He wore traditional Apache clothing but carried both a rifle and a cavalry saber that suggested a military background. Captain Hayes stared at the man in amazement, trying to understand how a white person had come to be fighting alongside Apache warriors against his own people. The figure moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in this harsh environment, and the Apache fighters clearly respected him as an equal, rather than treating him as a captive or outsider. The man called down to the soldiers in the clearing, his voice carrying easily across the open space. He identified himself as Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, formerly of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, though he said the title no longer held any meaning for him. He had been captured 3 years earlier during a patrol that had gone wrong, and instead of being killed, he had been adopted into the Apache tribe. Thompson explained that he had learned to see the world through Apache eyes, understanding that the white settlers and soldiers were the true invaders in this ancient land. The Apache were not savage killers as the army portrayed them, but people defending their homeland against an aggressive enemy that sought to destroy their way of life completely. The revelation that a former cavalry officer was now fighting with the Apache sent shockwaves through Hayes's company. Several soldiers began muttering that Thompson was a traitor who deserved to be shot, while others wondered if his presence might somehow improve their chances of survival. Thompson continued speaking, explaining that the Apache knew about the Army's plans to drive them from their traditional lands and force them onto reservations where they would slowly starve or die of diseases. The raids on wagon trains and settlements were acts of desperation by a people who had nowhere left to retreat. He told the trapped soldiers that they had been led into this natural amphitheater deliberately, following a trail of false clues left by Apache scouts who knew exactly how white soldiers thought and moved. The missing guide Carlos had not disappeared randomly, but had been an Apache agent all along, sent to lead the cavalry company into this perfect trap. Captain Hayes felt a mix of anger and admiration as he realized how completely they had been outmaneuvered. The Apache had used the Army's own assumptions against them, knowing that soldiers would follow obvious trails and believe they were the hunters rather than the hunted. It was a level of strategic thinking that contradicted everything the military had taught about Indian warfare. Thompson then made an offer that surprised everyone in the clearing. He said that the Apache war chief, who was revealed to be the famous leader Cochise himself, was willing to allow the soldiers to leave alive under certain conditions. They would have to abandon their weapons and horses, taking only water and basic supplies for the journey back to civilization. More importantly, they would have to swear an oath never to return to Apache lands or to reveal the location of this hidden stronghold to other military units. Any soldier who broke this promise would be hunted down and killed, along with his family if necessary. The Apache had ways of watching and waiting that white men could not imagine. The terms were humiliating for professional soldiers who had sworn to fight rather than surrender, but they offered the only chance of survival for Hayes and his men. The captain looked around at his company and saw that most of them were ready to accept any deal that would get them out of this death trap alive. Sergeant O'Malley whispered urgently to Hayes that they should accept the offer immediately before the Apache changed their minds. He had seen enough Indian fights to know that mercy from warriors like Cochise was extremely rare and should not be refused when offered. But Hayes struggled with the decision, knowing that accepting Thompson's terms would effectively end his military career. An officer who surrendered his command and weapons to the enemy could never expect to advance in rank or receive another important assignment. His reputation would be destroyed, and he would spend the rest of his life known as the captain who gave up without a fight. Private Chen and several other young soldiers began calling out that they wanted to accept the deal, their fear overcoming any concerns about military honor. They had joined the Army seeking adventure, not expecting to die in a remote canyon for causes they barely understood. Thompson gave Hayes 5 minutes to make his decision, warning that Cochise was not known for his patience with white soldiers. The war chief had already shown remarkable restraint by offering terms rather than simply killing everyone in the clearing, but that mercy would not last indefinitely. As the minutes ticked by, Hayes could feel the weight of responsibility for his men's lives pressing down on him, like a physical burden. Every decision he made would affect not just his own future, but the fate of more than 40 soldiers who trusted him to make the right choice. The Apache warriors on the cliff tops remained motionless as statues, their weapons ready but not yet aimed at the soldiers below. They seemed to understand that this was a moment of terrible decision for the white men, and they waited with the patience of people who had learned to think in terms of generations rather than moments. From his position among the rocks, Cochise watched the scene below with eyes that had seen too much warfare and too much death. He was tired of fighting battles that solved nothing and created only more enemies for his people. Perhaps showing mercy to these soldiers might plant a seed of understanding that could grow into something better than endless violence. Thompson called out that time was running short and Hayes needed to give his answer. The choice was simple but devastating. Surrender with honor intact but lives lost, or accept humiliation with the possibility that some of his men might see their homes again. Captain Hayes looked at the faces of his soldiers one more time, seeing young men who had families waiting for them, dreams they had not yet fulfilled and lives that deserved a chance to continue. Military honor was important, but it was not worth more than the lives of the men under his command. With a heavy heart, Hayes stood up slowly and called out his acceptance of Thompson's terms. The Apache war cries grew louder and more numerous, creating a terrifying symphony that bounced off the circular cliff walls and seemed to come from every direction at once. Captain Hayes shouted orders to his men, trying to establish some kind of defensive position in the exposed clearing. But there was nowhere to hide and no cover to be found. The soldiers formed a tight circle with their horses in the center, rifles pointed outward toward the cliff walls that towered above them. Their training had prepared them for battles on open ground against enemy soldiers, but this was something entirely different. They were trapped at the bottom of a natural stone bowl, completely exposed to attackers who remained invisible on the heights above. Private Chen's hands shook as he aimed his Springfield rifle at the empty cliff tops, searching desperately for a target. The war cries seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rocks until it was impossible to tell how many Apache warriors were surrounding them or exactly where they were positioned. Sergeant O'Malley had been in enough Indian fights to know that the Apache rarely attacked during daylight hours unless they held an overwhelming advantage. The fact that they were making so much noise suggested they wanted the soldiers to know they were trapped, building fear and panic before the real assault began. It was psychological warfare at its most effective. Captain Hayes tried to count the different voices in the war cries, estimating the size of the force they faced. But the echoes made it impossible to get an accurate count, and for all he knew, a handful of warriors might be creating the impression of a much larger war party. Or perhaps they were indeed surrounded by dozens of Apache fighters who could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The horses were becoming increasingly difficult to control, their instincts telling them to flee from the predators that surrounded them. Several soldiers had to dismount and hold their animals by the bridles to prevent them from bolting toward the narrow canyon entrance, which might already be blocked by Apache warriors waiting in ambush. As the afternoon sun moved across the sky, the war cries suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the noise had been, broken only by the nervous snorting of horses and the sound of soldiers breathing heavily from fear and exertion. Hayes ordered his men to remain alert and keep their weapons ready, knowing that the attack could come at any moment. Minutes passed like hours as the soldiers waited in the oppressive silence. The walls of the natural amphitheater seemed to be closing in on them, and several men began to show signs of panic. Private Chen whispered prayers under his breath while constantly checking and rechecking his rifle, as if the familiar motions might somehow protect him from the invisible enemies above. Then they saw him. A single Apache warrior appeared on the clifftop directly across from the canyon entrance, standing silhouetted against the blue sky like a statue carved from stone. He was tall and lean, with long black hair and traditional Apache clothing that seemed to blend with the red rocks around him. Even at a distance, there was something commanding about his presence that made the soldiers understand they were looking at a war chief. The warrior raised his arms above his head and let out a long, piercing cry that was answered immediately by voices from all around the circular clearing. Dozens of Apache fighters appeared on the clifftops, emerging from hiding places among the rocks like spirits materializing from another world. They carried bows, rifles, and traditional weapons, and their painted faces showed no emotion as they looked down at the trapped soldiers. Captain Hayes felt his heart sink as he realized the true scope of their situation. They were vastly outnumbered by warriors who held the high ground and could attack from complete safety. The Apache had turned the natural amphitheater into a perfect killing ground, and his company had walked directly into their trap. The war chief on the opposite cliff began to speak in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Though none of the soldiers understood his words, his tone made his message clear. This was their land, and the soldiers were trespassers who would pay the price for their intrusion. Sergeant O'Malley whispered to Captain Hayes that they needed to try negotiating rather than fighting. The Apache sometimes took prisoners, especially officers who might be valuable for exchange. Fighting would only result in the death of every man in the company, while surrender might save at least some lives. But Hayes knew that military protocol demanded he fight rather than surrender to what the army considered savage enemies. His career and reputation would be destroyed if he gave up without a battle, even if fighting meant certain death for his men. The contradiction between military duty and common sense created a terrible dilemma that had no good solution. The Apache war chief raised his hand, and suddenly the air filled with arrows whistling down from the cliff tops. The soldiers dove for what little cover they could find behind rocks and their own horses, but there was nowhere to hide in the exposed clearing. The arrows fell like deadly rain, striking the ground all around them and sending up small clouds of dust with each impact. Miraculously, none of the first volley found human targets, though several horses screamed and fell with arrows in their sides. Hayes realized that the Apache were demonstrating their accuracy and giving the soldiers a chance to understand how hopeless their situation was. The next volley would not be a warning. Private Johnson, a farm boy from Ohio who had never seen combat before, broke under the pressure and jumped to his feet, screaming that he wanted to surrender. Before anyone could stop him, he threw down his rifle and began running toward the canyon entrance, waving his hands above his head and shouting that he gave up. He made it perhaps 50 yards before an arrow caught him in the back, sending him sprawling face first into the red sand. He lay motionless for a moment, then began crawling forward, leaving a trail of blood behind him as he continued trying to reach the canyon entrance. Another arrow ended his suffering and his body went still. The death of Private Johnson had a devastating effect on the morale of the remaining soldiers. They had watched a man die horribly while trying to surrender, making it clear that the Apache were not interested in taking prisoners. Every man in the company now understood that they would fight to the death whether they wanted to or not. Captain Hayes looked around at his remaining soldiers and saw fear, desperation, and growing panic in their faces. They were professional soldiers who had signed up to serve their country, but nothing in their training had prepared them for this situation. They were about to die in a remote canyon that most people had never heard of, killed by enemies they had never seen clearly. The Apache war chief raised his hand again, and Hayes knew that the real attack was about to begin. This time there would be no warning shots, no demonstration of mercy. The next arrows would be aimed to kill, and there were enough Apache warriors on the cliff tops to rain down death until every soldier in the clearing was dead. As he prepared to give his men their final orders, Hayes wondered if anyone would ever find their bodies, or know what had happened to Company B of the 8th Cavalry Regiment in the Red Rocks of Arizona Territory. Captain Hayes stood over the empty bedroll where Carlos had slept, his mind racing through possibilities. The Apache scout had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faint impression of his body in the sand and a growing sense of unease among the soldiers. Hayes knew that losing their guide in this maze of canyons could mean death for his entire company. Sergeant O'Malley examined the ground around the missing scout's position, looking for any clue about how or why Carlos had disappeared. The hard-packed earth revealed nothing useful, no footprints leading away from the camp, no signs of struggle, no indication of which direction he might have gone. It was as if the man had simply evaporated into the desert air. The soldiers gathered around their captain, waiting for orders and trying to hide their growing fear. Private Chen clutched his rifle tighter, his knuckles white against the dark metal. He had joined the army expecting to fight honorable battles against enemy soldiers, not to hunt ghosts through cursed valleys where guides disappeared in the night. Hayes made the decision to continue forward despite losing Carlos. Turning back now would mean admitting failure, and military careers were ruined by such admissions. Besides, they had come too far to retreat without accomplishing their mission. The Apache warriors they were tracking could not be far ahead, and with luck, they might still capture or kill some of Cochise's band before returning to the fort. The company resumed their march deeper into Red Valley as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The red rock seemed to glow with an inner fire, and the heat began building early, promising another scorching day in the Arizona desert. The soldiers rode in single file along the narrow trail, their horses picking their way carefully over loose stones and around massive boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls. As they traveled, Hayes noticed that the valley was changing. The walls were becoming higher and more sheer, cutting off any possibility of escape to either side. The path ahead twisted and turned through a series of natural corridors that could easily hide an army of warriors. Every bend in the trail could conceal an ambush. Every shadow might hide an Apache bowman. Around midday, Private Johnson spotted something that made the entire company halt in their tracks. Carved into the red rock wall was a series of symbols and pictures that could only be Apache artwork. The images showed warriors dancing around fires, hunting animals, and engaged in what appeared to be battle scenes. But most disturbing were the pictures that seemed to depict soldiers falling from their horses with arrows in their bodies. Carlos would have been able to interpret these symbols. But without their scout, the soldiers could only guess at their meaning. Some of the men muttered that the pictures were warnings, telling them to turn back before it was too late. Others argued that they were simply old decorations left by Indians who had passed through years earlier. Hayes ordered the company to continue, but he could feel the morale of his men beginning to crack. They were deep in hostile territory, far from any support, following a trail that might lead nowhere. The disappearance of their guide had shaken everyone's confidence, and the strange rock art only added to their sense of walking into a trap. As afternoon approached, they reached a place where the valley split into 3 separate canyons. Each passage looked identical, winding away into the red rock landscape and disappearing around bends that hid their destinations. Without Carlos to guide them, Hayes had no way of knowing which path to follow. The captain called a halt and consulted his map, though the hand-drawn chart provided little detail about this remote area. The 3 canyons were marked but not labeled, giving no indication of where each might lead. They could spend days exploring each passage, using up precious water and supplies while the Apache warriors they were tracking escaped deeper into the desert. Sergeant O'Malley suggested splitting the company into 3 groups to explore each canyon simultaneously. Hayes considered this option but decided it was too dangerous. Dividing their force would make each group vulnerable to attack, and if one group encountered the Apache, the others would be too far away to provide assistance. Instead, Hayes chose the middle canyon, reasoning that it appeared to be the most traveled of the 3 paths. Fresh horse droppings near the entrance suggested that animals had passed this way recently, though whether they belonged to Apache ponies or wild horses was impossible to determine. The middle canyon proved to be even narrower than the main valley, with walls so close together that the soldiers had to ride in single file. The afternoon sun was blocked by the towering rock faces, creating a twilight atmosphere even in the middle of the day. Strange echoes bounced off the walls, making every sound seem amplified and distorted. After an hour of slow progress through the winding passage, the soldiers emerged into a circular clearing surrounded by high cliff walls. It was a natural amphitheater with only one entrance, the narrow canyon they had just traveled through. Ancient pictographs covered the walls, depicting scenes of Apache ceremonies and rituals that had taken place in this sacred spot for countless generations. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones arranged around the remains of old campfires. The ashes were cold and scattered by wind, but some of the stones still showed scorch marks from recent use. Hayes dismounted and examined the area carefully, looking for any clue about who had been here and how long ago they had departed. Private Chen found something that made his blood run cold. Scattered around the fire circle were pieces of blue cloth that looked like they had been torn from army uniforms. Mixed with the fabric were brass buttons bearing the insignia of the United States Cavalry. Hayes examined the items and realized they belonged to soldiers who had passed this way before his company. The implications were terrifying. Another cavalry unit had reached this place ahead of them, but where were the soldiers now? There were no bodies, no weapons, no horses, just these scattered remnants of military uniforms left behind like trophies. Hayes began to understand that his company was not the hunters in this situation. but rather the prey being led into an elaborate trap. As the soldiers stood in the eerie clearing, surrounded by cliff walls that seemed to close in on them like prison bars, they heard a sound that froze their blood. From somewhere high above them came the distinctive war cry of Apache warriors, a haunting call that echoed off the rock walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The horses began to panic, rearing and whinnying in terror as the war cries multiplied and grew louder. The soldiers raised their rifles and looked frantically for targets, but they could see nothing except empty cliff tops and dark shadows where their enemies might be hiding. Captain Hayes realized with growing horror that his company had walked directly into an Apache stronghold, a natural fortress where the warriors could attack from above while remaining completely protected. They were trapped in the bottom of a stone bowl with no escape route except the narrow canyon they had entered through, and that passage could easily be blocked by a handful of Apache fighters. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red rocks of Arizona Territory as Captain William Hayes adjusted his uniform and surveyed the landscape before him. It was September 1869, and the United States Army had been fighting Apache warriors for what seemed like an endless war. Hayes commanded Company B of the 8th Cavalry Regiment, a unit that had seen more blood and death than any soldier should witness in a lifetime. The captain was a tall man with weathered skin and eyes that had grown hard from watching too many good men die. He had arrived in Arizona 3 years earlier, full of confidence and military training from the Civil War. But fighting Confederate soldiers was nothing like battling Apache warriors who knew every rock, every canyon, and every hiding place in this unforgiving desert. Red Valley stretched out before them like a wound in the earth. The rocks were stained deep crimson from iron deposits, giving the place its name and an ominous appearance that made even veteran soldiers uneasy. Local settlers whispered stories about this place, claiming it was cursed and that Apache spirits roamed the valley at night. Hayes dismissed such talk as superstition, but he could not shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. His orders were simple, yet dangerous. Major General George Crook had commanded all cavalry units to pursue and capture, or kill the Apache leader known as Cochise, who had been leading raids against settler wagon trains and mining camps throughout the territory. Intelligence reports suggested that Cochise and his band of warriors were hiding somewhere in the maze of canyons and caves that surrounded Red Valley. The company consisted of 47 soldiers, most of them young men who had joined the army seeking adventure or escaping troubles back east. They rode sturdy horses and carried the latest Springfield rifles, believing their superior weapons and military training would give them an advantage over what they considered primitive savages. How wrong they would prove to be. Sergeant Michael O'Malley rode alongside Captain Hayes, his Irish accent still thick despite years in America. O'Malley had been fighting Indians longer than anyone in the company, and his scarred face told stories of battles won and lost. He was one of the few men who understood that the Apache were not the simple warriors that Army reports made them out to be. They were skilled fighters who had been defending their homeland for generations. The soldiers had been tracking a group of Apache for 3 days, following horse tracks and broken branches through the desert. Their Apache scout, a man named Carlos, who had been captured as a child and raised by missionaries, led them deeper into the valley. Carlos had agreed to help the army in exchange for protection and payment, but his loyalties remained unclear. He often stared at the horizon with sad eyes, as if remembering something the soldiers could never understand. As they entered Red Valley, the walls of rock rose high on both sides, creating a natural corridor that made the soldiers nervous. The horses seemed to sense danger too, their ears twitching at every sound and their steps becoming more cautious. Hawks circled overhead, their cries echoing off the canyon walls like warnings from another world. Hayes called for a halt near a small spring where they could water the horses and rest. The men dismounted gratefully, their bodies sore from days in the saddle. Some filled their canteens while others checked their weapons. Private Tommy Chen, barely 18 years old and fresh from San Francisco, sat on a rock and wrote in his diary. He had been sending letters home to his mother, describing the adventure of fighting Indians, though he left out the parts about the fear that kept him awake at night. The captain studied his map, trying to determine their exact position. According to Carlos, the Apache camp was somewhere ahead, hidden in the maze of side canyons that branched off from the main valley. But something felt wrong. In 3 days of tracking, they had seen no fresh signs of the warriors they were pursuing. No campfires, no recent tracks, no evidence that anyone had passed this way recently. Sergeant O'Malley approached Hayes with concern written across his weathered features. The two men had served together since Hayes arrived in Arizona, and O'Malley had learned to trust his instincts about danger. Something about this place made his skin crawl, though he could not explain why. The silence was too perfect, too complete. Even the desert animals seemed to have disappeared. As the afternoon wore on, the soldiers continued deeper into Red Valley. The walls grew higher and the path narrower, creating shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Carlos became increasingly nervous, frequently looking over his shoulder and muttering prayers in Spanish. When Hayes asked what was troubling him, the scout simply shook his head and said that this place held too many ghosts. The company made camp that evening in a small clearing where the valley widened slightly. They built no fires, following standard procedure when tracking hostile Indians. The men ate cold rations and spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets while trying to ignore the strange sounds that echoed through the canyon. Hayes posted guards at both ends of their camp and tried to sleep, but rest would not come. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, from the wind whistling through the rocks to the distant call of a coyote. Somewhere in the night, he thought. He heard the sound of drums, though when he listened carefully, he could hear nothing but his own heartbeat. Private Chen wrote his final diary entry that night, describing the beauty of the stars above Red Valley, and his hope that they would complete their mission soon and return to the safety of the fort. He sealed the letter to his mother and placed it carefully in his pack, planning to mail it when they returned to civilization. He had no way of knowing that his words would become a historical record of the last peaceful night his company would ever experience. As dawn approached, Carlos disappeared. The guards swore they had seen nothing, but when Hayes went to wake the scout, he found only an empty bedroll and no trace of where the man had gone. The Apache scout had vanished as silently as smoke, leaving behind only a sense of impending doom and the growing realization that the hunters had somehow become the hunted in the crimson shadows of Red Valley.